Hello everyone, I am Zohmingmawii and I will be giving a lecture on victim psychology, and I am from the Department of Clinical Psychology. So in order to understand victim psychology, we have to know who is a victim first. So who is a victim? A victim is a person who has been hurt as a result of a crime. They tend to feel helpless and passive in the face of misfortune or mistreatment. One way or the other, we have all been victims of a crime, and this crime that we talk about can either be a criminal case or a civil case. Many people are victimized by crimes without being aware of it. And victimization comes in various forms. Number one is criminal cases like homicide, rape, abduction, physical and sexual assault. And the second case that we have is civil cases like fraud, identity theft, embezzlement of funds, and etc. And even though it is more common and frequent for the latter to occur in our day-to-day life, people are more worried for the former to occur, that is criminal cases. But actually, in reality, civil cases, like we've said, fraud, identity theft, occur more. And victims of civil cases, example credit card fraud, also go through emotional and financial harm, even though they may not be as gut-wrenching and emotionally harmful as criminal cases like physical assault. And thus, we can say that victimization is broad, and although we will be focusing only on criminal cases in this chapter, it is important to highlight that. And it is important to note that victimization frequently occurs in the civil context as opposed to criminal context. And for example, victims of civil wrongs such as discrimination, unsafe working conditions, and negligence on the part of the others is fairly common in numerous settings. And so what do forensic psychologists do in this context? And forensic psychologists in action tells us about how forensic psychologists help in consulting with attorneys, assessing crime victims, providing expert testimony on the psychological effects of violent victimization, assessing psychological harm of plaintiffs in civil suits. Civil suits also mean civil cases, and providing psychological information for victim impact statements. And victims of crimes like IPV, that is known as intimate partner violence, sexual assaults and abuse, child abuse, elderly abuse, or hate or bias crimes need help in many areas, and an important skill of the forensic psychologist is to be able to assess the victim's crime-related experience and responses. Now we will move on to the types of victimizations. The first one that we have is multiculturalism and victimization. Multiculturalism in its broadest sense, in its broadest terms, not only is defined by race and ethnicity, but also involves topics of gender, sexual orientation, and disability. So when we talk about multiculturalism, it does not only belong to, we don't only mean different kinds of ethnic groups, but we also mean different areas of society. And in America, with a growing number of immigrants, forensic psychologists work with these immigrants to promote a sense of safety, which is an important task that requires a high degree of cross-cultural sensitivity. According to Su et al., well-trained forensic psychologists need to realize that the traditional psychological concepts and theories used in assessment and treatment approaches were developed from predominantly Euro-American context. This is because in the earlier days, more people from Europe immigrated to America. So right now the growing trend is people from Southeast Asia, Middle Eastern people have, immigrated more to America than the former. So it is important to note that the traditional psychological concepts may be out of date, and it may be limited in their application to racial and culturally diverse populations, since the demographic of immigrants over the past few years have changed. disability and victimization. So victimization of PWDs is a neglected area of research. However, it is interesting to know that several laws have been passed by certain countries to protect PWDs in workplaces and at home. So according to an American criminal victimization data, crimes against children and adults with disabilities far exceed people who do not have disabilities. So when we talk about these disabilities, it can either be physical or mental disabilities. And in India, the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 was passed, and this act highlighted the classification of disability and stressed on the protection and rights of PWDs in India. Next, we have violence victimization. The psychological impact of criminal violence can be more troubling to the victims than the physical injury itself. So that means that even the psychological trauma is sometimes more troubling to the victim than the physical injury that they got from the assaulters. And these reactions to victimization can range from mild to severe, and such cases can lead to the victim suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. And next we have homicide victimization. When we talk about homicide, it basically points to murder. So in America, homicide victims represent the smallest proportion, that is 1.3% of the violent crime victims. But the psychological devastation as experienced by those who survive them is enormous. So what we're basically talking about here is about how the family of the victims suffer after a homicide attack. And what is the role of forensic psychologists in homicides? Number one is death notification. And it is the role of the forensic psychologist to train the personnel who will notify the death of a loved one to families. Example is a police officer, a health worker has to be trained by a forensic psychologist or any other psychologist or mental health professional in order to break the news in a more gentle and humane way. And the next one that we have is complicated bereavement. And when we talk about bereavement, we talk about grief over a loved one, and complicated bereavement talks about people who find it difficult to grieve properly over a loved one who has passed away. So families of victims of homicide who go through a rough time accepting the death of a loved one in cases of homicides are given counseling and guidance by psychologists. And the next victimization that we have is sexual assault victimization. The offender in a sexual assault case can be a partner of the victim, an acquaintance, a relative, or even a complete stranger. But however, a large portion of such perpetrators are found to be an intimate partner, such as a boyfriend or a girlfriend of the victim, a parent, and so forth. And the types of sexual assaults are intimate partner violence, child sexual abuse, and sexual harassment, to name a few. And the next thing that we have is internet victimization. The first kind of internet victimization is an online sexual solicitation. And here, the users of internet have misused the internet vastly, and sometimes applications like WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram are used by grown adults to contact minors and interact with them sexually. And the use of the internet specifically for commercial sexual exploitation of children and the youth, which includes such behaviors as circulating pornographic images of children or of children being assaulted, is online sexual solicitation. And it also includes luring children for purposes of sex trafficking and offering children to others for sexual purposes. The next kind of internet victimization we have is human trafficking. And human trafficking, according to the APA, is the economic exploitation of an individual through force, fraud, or coercion. And the number of trafficked victims is extremely difficult to estimate because it grows day by day. And girls between the ages of 12 and 16 are at the greatest risk for the exploitation, according to the APA. However, it has been reported that the age of trafficked children has been getting younger, as young to 7 to 10 years of age, since this can also be because these days we all have smartphones, our children have smartphones, so the misuse of smartphones can lead to that also. And lastly, we have come to the psychological services. Okay, and what are the psychological services that forensic psychologists or people in the psychological field can provide for the victims of above mentioned fields? Limited research has, however, limited research has been done on this area, that is sexual harassment and stuff like that. And mental health professionals like psychologists and counselors are expected to provide their psychological expertise to such victims. So in order to conclude, we can say that forensic psychologists and other mental health practitioners will be increasingly employed as consultants, instructors, expert witnesses, evaluators, therapists, and service providers to victim service organizations in the coming years, and more research is to be covered in different areas.